targets in this week's series of attempted bombings are all perceived as anti-Trump, and if there is one lesser-known name among the people you see on this map, it would be George Soros. He's a billionaire financier, more behind the scenes than the politicians, but he's one of the biggest donors to Democratic causes, spending over $15 million this campaign cycle alone. Now, whether or not what we're seeing here is all linked, there are a widening number of attacks on these types of participation, whether it's activism or, in Soros's case, his apparent donating, which raises questions of whether there will be a chill or intimidating effect going forward. Well, tonight at a campaign rally in Wisconsin, the crowds awaiting President Trump are not holding back. Take a look at what just happened in the light of today's attempted attack on Hillary Clinton. Surrogate laughing along to the chance of lock her up. I am joined now by Tom Steyer, who himself, like George Soros, happens to be a billionaire with a lot of money going towards Democratic causes. He's given over $40 million, more than Soros, this cycle. Thank you for coming on tonight. This is a difficult time, and it is interesting and disturbing to many people to look at who is being targeted and what that means. As a prominent donor yourself, how do you view what is known about these attacks? Would it change anything that you're doing with your money or your participation?
Well, Ari, I view these attacks as profoundly anti-democracy and basic terrorist attacks on our political operation as a country. But in terms of how I'll personally respond, I'm very concerned about the safety and health of everybody that I work with. But I don't think that we can let this kind of terrorism change our participation in the American political system and in our democracy. So we've tried to take as many precautions as we can so that the people that I work with and who I care about can be completely safe. But at the same time, we've got to go forward and pursue our mission, which is as a grassroots organization to make sure we have the broadest and most inclusive democracy possible.
Do you view it then as a apparent political terrorism heading into the midterms?
Well, I think that what we've been hearing on your show is that this is an inevitable result of the overheated and violent rhetoric that we've been hearing from Mr. Trump and Republicans for years, including that chant that you just played of lock her up. But I think that there's something that hasn't been said that is equally important, which is this. We have seen a continued attack on democracy by Republican governors, by the Republican Party itself in terms of voter suppression, extreme gerrymandering, and the attempt to take away voting rights from citizens as recently as last week in Georgia. So what we're seeing really is political violence in an attempt to intimidate as part of a much broader campaign where the Republican Party has specifically gone past the bounds of custom, past the bounds of what is acceptable in political life. And we're hearing a group of Democrats today say, let's go back to the kind of comedy and good behavior that has characterized the American democracy
and Tom,
for hundreds of years.
You just mentioned custom on a night where everyone is waiting to see what the president does when he leaves the confines of a scripted event and goes to address a rally at a time where some people would say a rally itself is not fitting. I want to play again because this just happened and it's part of what's on the plate for how the president's going to deal with this. On the night that the news breaks about this attempted attack on Hillary Clinton, these chants. Take a look. Final thought, does the president have to affirmatively condemn that when he comes out on that stage tonight?
Look, of course the president has to condemn that. But I think there's something going on here, Ari, beyond that, which is this. He's sowed the wind, he's reaping the whirlwind. Can he really control the kind of anger and the kind of violence that he has incited, that he has promoted, that has been part of his appeal from the very beginning? Of course he should ask them to stop. Of course, he should say it's completely wrong. But in so doing, he will, of course, have to also say that his behavior and his attitude has been completely wrong. And I don't think that Mr. Trump can find it within himself to do that.
On a difficult night to talk about anything related to politics, Tom Steyer, we appreciate getting your view, and as someone who figures into some of these debates, particularly on the side of donations. Thank you very much. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.